Thank you for joining this morning. I am going to give a short tutorial with my colleague Matt Freeman about the Real-Time Geospatial Data Viewer. And this is a web application that will hopefully be helpful to you in being able to visualize and explore data that you may collect in the field. The way we're going to proceed is I'm going to give a short introductory overview. It'll be about 10 minutes long, and then Matt will proceed with doing a live demonstration of the tool, and we will have time at the end for questions. We also will be looking at the chat during the presentation in case there's questions on the fly that are asked that we may be able to answer in the flow of what we're talking about. So please, throughout the presentation, don't hesitate to put questions into the chat. We will be monitoring that. Heidi Paulson, who's co-hosting, she's also going to try to keep an eye on the chat for any technical problems. And we also are monitoring RETIGO at EPA.gov. If for some reason you get stuck outside the webinar, that's a way that we can be reached during the event. So I'm going to move to our next slide here. So what I'm going to talk about is the general background to RETIGO, how it's been designed and its timeline of development, and then hand the mic over to Matt. So RETIGO was developed partly in response to what's been a exciting development in air monitoring technology for a wide variety of applications. When I started in air monitoring, it was pretty simple, and the data was fairly small in the size of the measurements. As the technology's progressed, it's diversifying in many different ways. I'm showing just a few examples. One would be a car that's equipped with air monitoring instruments that measure very quickly. And in this case, these are higher-end monitors, and they can report data very quickly and may also report a large volume of data. There's also miniaturized air quality sensors that are being developed and being used in a wide variety of ways, both stationary and in mobile applications. You can see here some examples of sensors added to bicycles or wearable, as well as a variety of different ways of doing small footprint monitoring in a stationary way. And similarly, the data may be at different kinds of time rates. There may be different types of variables being reported that may include both air quality variables, but also other things like wind speed and direction or other meteorological data. This kind of emerging technology is leading to data that is growing in complexity. So you may have a large number of rows of data. You also have a lot of variety out there in how the data is formatted. So one of the most troublesome variables is how time is represented. And if you take 10 different monitoring technologies and how the data is logged, you may have 10 different formats in how time is represented. In some cases, some monitors or sensors may not include a date. In some cases, they're reporting in a serial format, which would be like a fractional day, or it could be in cumulative seconds. And so I'm showing just a few examples. So overall, what this type of data is leading to and has been causing for probably 10 years is for many air monitoring researchers to develop abilities to write scripts to be able to import, process, and visualize this data. And using programming languages such as MATLAB, Igor, and R to process and visualize this data. And that has a steep learning curve and has created a major technical barrier for people who don't have programming capabilities or time to learn these languages and develop custom scripts. An alternative solution that many businesses and some in universities have developed is where there's a custom visualization of data for a particular type of hardware, and that may be a website or an application, and where there is this pairing and sort of a streamlined view of that data. However, if you have a different type of monitoring equipment, or you're wanting to change the configuration of what you're measuring, then you're sort of needing to start over and have another development of a custom app or website to go with the new hardware. And so overall, what we saw as a need was a more flexible approach that would reduce the technical barrier to be able to explore your own data that's being collected from these new types of technologies. So what is RETIGO? RETIGO, it stands for Real-Time Geospatial Data Viewer. This is a free application developed by the United States Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Research and Development, and it's hosted on our website. And it is both technology and pollutant agnostic. You can configure your data to sync up with RETIGO and be able to explore that data. It's been designed from the mindset of air quality research. However, RETIGO can actually support visualizing any data that's numeric and has a timestamp, a latitude, and a longitude. And we do know of cases where people are using RETIGO to look at water quality research data. So it's not limited, and it does not recognize the format or the form of the data that's being imported. It won't recognize this is PM 2.5 or nitrogen dioxide. It just knows this is a numeric variable that has associated time and location, and then creates a lot of plots. Those plots have been designed from the air quality research perspective, so there's some that may not be appropriate for other kinds of variables, but they're there, and you have freedom to explore your data as you'd like. We designed it to require no more than a basic understanding of Microsoft Excel in order, or similar spreadsheet type software to prepare your data to include into RETIGO. So you should not need to do any kind of script writing or programming to prepare your data. And we will show, how you can get from various types of data formats into the RETIGO format. And also RETIGO is flexible to support different time bases of data, as well as different numbers of variables that may be logged together. This is an active project. It's been ongoing for a number of years, and we are continuing to support and improve RETIGO, so we're always welcome feedback on what might be improvements to it in the future. And this is our timeline of development so far. We are currently releasing the third set of updates from its original release. In each release, we sort of taken feedback and looked at how we can improve the performance of RETIGO and provide new features. In our tutorial today, we are effectively doing RETIGO 101 that covers all the features that have ever been released. We may not be able to cover every single possible way to use RETIGO. We have also tutorial information online that can take you through every possible function in RETIGO. And so we will cover everything. We may emphasize a little bit more some of the new features, but we're trying to cover, this from the mindset that people who are attending today may never have used RETIGO or have seen it before. This is our best way to contact us if you run into challenges trying to use RETIGO or just have ideas you want to share. I'm also sharing my personal email, so I'm the principal investigator for this tool, and I'm happy to have conversations about possible future directions. At this point, I'm going to pass the reins over to Matt. You're going to see a short interruption in the screen share as I switch to a web browser. So at this point you should see, I'm going to go to RETIGO Home, you should see a screen come up that shows the web browser for RETIGO. If anyone does not see this, please let me know. Okay, great. Thank you for confirming, Heidi. All right, thank you, Matt.
Okay, thanks, Gail. So this is the RETIGO main page. If you go to epa.gov/RETIGO, you'll come to this page. And there's a little bit of information about the tool. And you'll see a box over on the right-hand side called Quick Links. And from there, there's a number of things you can do. I'm not going to click on all of these, but I'll just give you an idea of what they are. There's a fact sheet which you can click on, and it'll take you to like a 2-page document that describes the tool in general terms and the types of things you can do with it. There's a tutorial section that you can go to that has a step-by-step tutorial on how to use the tool, how to bring your data into it and use it. There's also a few videos that you can look at. One of them deals with how to format your data properly, and then another one on how to bring your data in and use the tool. Those videos are relative to an earlier version of RETIGO that has a little bit different look and maybe not quite as many features, but it should kind of get you started. The step-by-step tutorial is up to date with the most recent version that I'm going to show today. There's another tutorial on how to create your file. There's a frequently asked questions list that you can look at if you have some questions about it. If you have a question that isn't answered there, you can always email us retigo@epa.gov. That'll come to Gail and to Heidi and I think to myself. Another thing that's there is a utility tool called the timestamp converter. I won't talk about that now, but after I do the demo, we can come back to that and talk about it. That's a utility that can help you get your time into the proper format. As Gail mentioned, there's a lot of different ways that some of the instruments handle time, and this utility will help you get it into the international standard that RETIGO uses. The last thing that I will click on is called Enter Your Data into RETIGO. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. That brings you to this main page. All of those, you can get back to the home page, you can get to the tutorials and the FAQ up at the top. I'm just going to dive in and load a file in that we already have prepared. So just select that file and hit View, and then that will put us straight into the tool. And then what I'm going to do from here on out is just try to orient you to the various controls and menus and show you the types of things that you can do in RETIGO. So what we're looking at here, you can see there's a map and there's some data points on the map. So that's the data that was in our file. Just as a reminder, as Gail mentioned, this is oriented toward geospatial data, which means that each data point is tagged with a time that the data was taken, its location, latitude and longitude, and then for that measurement, you can have any number of variables that were measured. So you can think of those as rows in a spreadsheet, for example. In this case, we had 3 variables that were measured. I'll show you those in a second. They were carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, and then the speed of the vehicle that was actually taking the data. So this data was taken near Charleston, South Carolina, and it was a vehicle that was outfitted with instrumentation, and that vehicle drove around various routes over the course of several hours, I think. And that's what you're seeing here. So you're seeing this, in this case, the carbon monoxide concentrations that are color-coded. There's a reference color bar down here at the bottom. And up at the top, there's a slider. So this is one of the main controls. And as you move this slider, you're advancing through time. So you're seeing, as I move this slider, I'm seeing where the vehicle was at a specific time and the data that was measured at that time. So you can see there's a marker. I've just halted it at this time. There's a marker that shows exactly where the vehicle was, and then the color indicates the data value. And then up at the top, you can see the exact time at that point and also the exact data value. Okay. I can zoom the map in and out. I can switch to satellite mode if you'd prefer to see that. So this is basically a fully functioning Google map. You can do the types of things you're used to doing in Google Map. You can even look at a street view and see your data embedded in the street view. That's discussed on the tutorial. You can look at that if you're interested in that. So just to further orient you to the interface, there's two main tabs over here on the right. The first one is called My Data, and when you have that one selected, you see this set of controls. So we'll be sort of skipping around talking about different things that you can do with these controls, and then I'll go through that, and then when I'm done with that, we'll switch to the Merge menu, and that's going to completely change this set of controls into another set that allows you to overlay different data on top of your data that it may be helpful to look at that overlaid data. We'll talk about that in a second. So for now, I'm just going to go to the bottom of the My Data menu, and this is where you can select which variable you want to look at. So these were variables that were in our file. I'm going to switch it to NO2, nitrogen dioxide. This is measured in parts per billion. So you can see that all of this data was measured basically at the same places that the CO data was measured, but now we're looking at NO2. So all of my colors changed, my color bar changed accordingly. The default data range, so the tool kind of senses the minimum and maximum data values you had in your file, and it sets the data range to that, so that you'll always see the full range of your data. But in this case, it was from 3 to 26 parts per billion. So I'm going to go ahead and override that and make it something a little bit nicer range. So I'll make it from 0 to 30. And when I enter those values, everything updates instantaneously. So I can continue interrogating my data through time. Okay, so since this data is inherently time-oriented, time-based, a natural thing to do would be to look at a traditional time series. So over here in the upper part of the menu, I can choose to look at a time series plot. And so we're plotting the NO2 data value on the y-axis, and then the time that it was taken on the x-axis. So this is a traditional time series. And then as I go back and start moving my time slider again, you can still see over on the map, you can see where the vehicle was and what the instantaneous data value was. But on the time series plot on the right, it's also linked to this time slider. So I can see there's a little black circle around the exact data point that I have selected with my slider. And I'll be showing some other plots, a few other types of plots, and they're all linked in the same way. So everything is linked together so that when you're visualizing one plot, it's linked to whatever other plots you may have active at that time. So one thing to be aware of is when we're plotting data on the map, we need to limit that to roughly 1,000 points for practical purposes. If it's more than that, it tends to slow down a little bit. So if your data has more than 1,000 points, it's okay. The tool can handle it. We've tested the tool up to many hundreds of thousands of data points, and it works okay. So the way it does that is it will automatically average your data in order to end up with roughly 1,000 points. So for example, if you had a data file that had 10,000 points, it would realize that and then average together every 10 points, and therefore you'd be left with about 1,000. So by default, when you first load your data, you're looking at it in this average mode. If you'd prefer to see your full resolution data, you can do that. And I'll come down to this section of the menu called time range, and I can switch it into what we call block mode. So when I'm in block mode, I'm now looking at my full resolution data, and I can see that there are any number of blocks to choose from, and these blocks are referenced by their starting time. So I've just picked one here. You can see now I'm seeing only the portion of the time series for that particular block, and I'm only seeing on the map the data corresponding to that block. And as I zoom in, you'll see this is much higher resolution than what we were looking at before, since this is not averaged. You can still use my time slider to look at the data in this particular block. Okay. If I want, I can go to a different block and it'll automatically load that in. And so I can just step through my data block by block this way, looking at the full resolution data here. And we've just come into the map. I was zoomed out a little bit. Sometimes people have asked, they wanted to see a little bit more of the time series than just one of these blocks. So we added the ability to extend the blocks. When you do that, we have to put the map into single point mode. So rather than showing all the points in the block, we're just going to show the one that you have selected with the time slider. There's a little warning that indicates this. So here I've extended the block, so I'm looking at 2 blocks at a time. I could make it 3 or 4 if I want to. I think even up to 5. So you can see a little bit more of your time series this way. And I can still see when I move the time slider, I can still see where the vehicle was, but I'm only seeing that single point. And if I want to remind myself as to what the route that the vehicle took, I can select this option called Show Connecting Line. And so then I'm kind of reminded as to what route the vehicle took, and then I can see exactly where it was at the particular instant of time that I have selected. So that's sort of a compromise that allows you to see a little bit more of your time series. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off and go back to average mode, and then I can just reselect show all points on the map to get back to the view that we were looking at before. Okay, so now I'll show you a little bit different type of plot that you can choose. So I'll put away the time series and bring up the analysis plot, which is currently blank. What this plot will do is it will plot your data as a function of distance away from some reference location, which you have to define. there's two ways to define it. First, you can define a single point. So I can come up to this toolbar up at the top. It's called Create Analysis Marker. I'll just click that and then come over to my map, click somewhere on the map, and I've now defined a reference point. And so now every one of the data points in my data set is plotted, that data value is plotted on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, instead of time, we're plotting the distance that that data point is away from my reference marker. So as I move through my data sets, you can see that we're still linked. So I can see that this data point was a little bit more than 1,200 meters away from that reference point. So this might be useful if you thought that there was a point source of whatever species that you're measuring. If you didn't get your point in exactly the right place, you can click on it, move it around, and as you do so, the plot will update accordingly. So all those distances will be recalculated on the fly. Okay, and then if I want to stop looking at that point, I can right-click on the pin, and then I'll get rid of it. Now there's another way of using the analysis plot where rather than plotting every point relative to a reference location, I can plot it relative to a polyline. And I'll do that by selecting the toolbar icon that says Create Analysis Line. I'll click on it, and then I can define a line. And I want to make this line approximate the shape or the contour of the interstate that was near where we took the data. So right now it's not a very good approximation. It's just a straight line. But there's always a control point in the center of the line, which you can grab and modify. And as you do so, there's two new line segments created, and they each have a control point in the middle. And so you can just very quickly build up a pretty decent approximation of a roadway, even if it curves around. So here we have a pretty decent approximation of this interstate highway. So this might be useful if you're looking for gradients in your measured variable away from a source like a road. I'll actually switch back to the carbon monoxide concentration, the CO concentration, and you can see that this one does have a pretty discernible gradient where you're seeing high values of CO pretty close to the roadway, so near the origin, and then as you move out the x-axis, you tend to see the values going down. So we've found a gradient in a spatial gradient in our measured variable. Okay, I'm going to switch back to NO2 real quick, and I'll bring up the time series again, so we can actually show. So now we're seeing, the map on the left. Our analysis plot is in the middle, and our time series is on the right, all linked together, as I mentioned, as I move the time slider. One more function that you can use on the toolbar, the last one over here, it's called Crop Region. And to use that, I'll click it, and then I can just click and drag and maybe define a region of interest on the map. And so when you do that, then you're only going to see data that's within that region. So you'll notice that the analysis plot and the time series plot both changed and are only showing data that originated from within that spatial region. So as I move my time slider, I'm now coming down into that region. The vehicle entered that region, and you can see on both of the graphs where that data is. And then as the vehicle exits that region, that that data is not plotted anymore. And I think that the vehicle drove the same path over and over and over, so as I keep going, we'll come back into that region. So that's why we have these little vertical bands on the time series as the vehicle entered that region and then left it. And then to get rid of that, if you don't want to look at that anymore, you can right-click inside the box, and that deletes it. Come back to the normal view. I can do the same thing with the analysis line to stop looking at that. Okay, and I'll put that one away. So that's pretty much of an orientation of the My Data tab, the types of things that you can do. There's a few more things that are mentioned in the tutorial section, but that's a pretty good overview. One other thing that I'll mention is that if you want to save your graphics, so let's say you wanted to save the time series or the analysis plot, there's a little button up above the plot called Save Image. You click it and you just basically give it a file name. It'll save out a PNG file, and it's essentially exactly as you see the plot on the screen. That's the file that you'll get. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to switch over to the Merge menu. So when I click this tab, all of these controls are going to change. So this will allow you to do two things. You can pull in data from the AirNow network. So this is a network of reference monitors, ground level measurements, typically hourly, of various pollutants, ground level pollutants. You can actually, if you're not really familiar with AirNow, you can hover the mouse over these options, like under Add to Map, and it gives you a little bit more information about what it is. So this one is hourly ozone concentrations in parts per billion. So we have ozone, particulate matter, 2.5 micron, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide that you can bring in. You can also bring in data from meteorological stations worldwide through the METAR network. And this is data that's typically collected at airports, both large and small, throughout the world. So you can bring in things like air temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed, and direction. So let me, okay, we had a question come in. Let me read it here. Does the region selection tool have an option for other polygon shapes other than rectangular? Can the shape be drawn freeform? No, it's basically just rectangular. So when you use that cropping tool, you basically click in one spot, and that defines one corner of the rectangle, and you drag to another place on the map, and when you release the mouse, that defines the opposing corner of the rectangle. So yeah, we can only do rectangular at this time. Okay, so I'm going to zoom the map out just a little bit, and then I'll bring in some data. I'm going to add some data, some of the reference monitoring data from AirNow. Hang on just a second. Okay, so I'll bring in, since we're looking at NO2, I'll bring in data, NO2 data from AirNow. So you can see that I clicked it, and then there's a little icon that showed up on the map where the NO2 reference monitor is. If I hover over that icon, if I hover the mouse over it, I see what the concentration was for this particular hour, and it gives the averaging interval of that data, and it will correspond to the time that I have selected. So when you choose this option, RETIGO already knows the time extent of your data and also the spatial extent of the data. And so when it goes and makes a web service call to the AirNow API, it folds all that information in, and so it's only pulling back data that is near your data spatially and also covers the same temporal extent of your data. So as I move the time slider, maybe move to a different hour, then when I hover the mouse over the icon again, all that will be updated, and it should be the same hour that I have selected in my time slider. Okay, and I can pull in other things too. So maybe I'll pull in PM 2.5, and so you can see there were a couple of stations nearby. As I zoom out, I guess there aren't any closer than that. So it pulls them in a certain radius away from the centroid of your data. I could also pull in the meteorological data from METAR. So these all have a little bit different icons indicating what they are. If you want to add the same data to your time series, you can do that using the set of menus below. So you don't necessarily have to be looking at the same ones that you have on your map, but it's kind of nice to sort of know where the data is in relation spatially to your data. So it's kind of nice to have both of them. So I'll add NO2 data since that's what we have measured. So I click that, and then the AirNow data appears in this sort of brownish red color, and there's a separate y-axis for the AirNow data. It's completely independent than the axis for our data, and therefore it can have a different range. And it was decided to do it that way to give maximum flexibility, and also because you don't necessarily have to add the same exact quantity. So I could, rather than NO2, I could have picked a different variable and it would show it. So if you do want your axis range to be the same, you can control the AirNow axis with this data range. So I just made it 0 to 30, just like our measured data is. Okay. So I could also choose to show maybe the METAR temperature. And by default, the station, since there's multiple stations that have these measurements, by default it's always going to show you the one that is closest to the centroid of your data. But if you prefer to see a different station, you can do that. So if I wanted to see the temperature from this station to the south, I can just click on that, and then my graph will update with that data. And you can see that the station that I have selected kind of has this little halo around it. There's a blue halo for the meteorological data and a green halo for the AirNow data. I could choose one a little farther away if I want. And you can only show one of these variables at a time overlaid on the time series plot. So now I've switched it to AirNow PM 2.5. I need to, since my reference monitor location that's haloed didn't actually have any PM 2.5, so there's nothing being plotted. So I need to make sure and select a PM station. So I can go pick either one of those. Okay. And again, you can save the image. It'll have the overlay plot basically exactly as you see it. That's what you'll get when you save the image. So at this point, let's see, we do have another question come in, I just noticed. It says, can I upload data for PM 2.5 from my standard air monitor I'm already using into the RETIGO map? Or do I need a specific brand of air monitor? So that's a great question. Yeah, you can pretty much, you don't need a specific brand of monitor. We'll talk in a second about how to construct a RETIGO file, but as long as you have a timestamp in the proper format, the latitude and longitude of where the data was taken, and just any numeric value, no matter where it comes from, you can visualize it in RETIGO. So RETIGO doesn't really know anything about the instrumentation that measured it. It doesn't really even know what the quantity is, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So you'll have to, when you construct a RETIGO file, there's a header line that sort of defines what each column in the file is, and you need to make sure to put a label in there that tells what the variable is that's being measured and what its units are. And that information is what gets repeated. So whatever you put in your file, that's, I've gone back to the My Data tab, and so these variables that you can select from, it's basically just repeating whatever was in the header file, or the header of the file that you loaded in. Okay, at this point, I'm going to go and look at a different file. I think we're maybe have about 20 minutes left. So I'll look at that real quick. This file has a little bit different character to it in that it is, rather than a vehicle that's driving around, this is just a stationary instrument. So I'm going to pick that file and view it. This is, I think, in New Jersey. So we can see the location of that instrument near the water. And as I move my time slider, of course, the map is a little less interesting since the instrument is stationary, so we don't see it moving around spatially, but we still see the instantaneous color-coded value. In this case, the things that were measured were NO2, sulfur dioxide, and black carbon concentration. And one other thing that was measured is the wind speed and direction. So when you have wind speed and direction, RETIGO understands that, and it turns it into a wind vector, which we can look at. So if I just choose wind vector as my variable, since I'm looking at all points, it's, everything in the whole file is being plotted on top of each other. So when you choose vectors, it's best to pick the single point mode, and then I see there's a little arrow there rather than a dot. The color of the arrow indicates the wind speed, and then the arrow is pointing in the direction that the wind is blowing. That's pretty handy. Another thing that you can do, I'll switch back to the NO2 concentration. There's another type of plot. We weren't able to look at it before because we didn't have wind data. But when you do have wind data, you can look at this plot called the wind pollution plot. And I'll actually go into block mode to the full resolution data. It's a little easier to explain what this plot is. So it's a polar plot. Each data point in my data set is being plotted on this, and as I move my time slider, it's linked in the same way that the other plots were, so I can see the exact point that I have selected for that time being shown on the plot. So the color of the point indicates the value of my measured variable, in this case NO2. And this is a polar plot. The distance that we are away from the origin is determined by the wind speed. So for example, if the wind speed is 2 meters per second, I would be on this circle. And then as I go out, if it was 4 meters per second, I'd be this far away from the origin, and 6 meters per second, and so forth. And then the quadrant of the plot, or the angle of the plot, is determined by the wind direction. So in this case, you can see that there were some high values of NO2 that were being picked up by our instrument when the wind is when we have a southerly wind. And that is probably due to whatever the source of the NO2 is, away from our instrument, and then the wind is advecting it into our sensor. So this can give you a good idea of when you have a stationary sensor and the wind is blowing and changing direction, you're sometimes going to see high values of what you're measuring and sometimes low values, and this will give you a way of sorting that out. Okay, and again, this is a plot. You can save this plot, and it'll have the color bar and everything in it. Okay, so I think that's a pretty good overview of the types of things you can do in RETIGO. At this point, we have a little more than 10 minutes left, so we can field some more questions, or we can also go back to the tutorial section and maybe talk a little bit more about the file format that you need to have your data in. So a question just came in: what is the best file format to upload data? Are there examples of how to format the data sets? Okay, perfect. So let me come to the tutorial section, how to use RETIGO. And I'll just scroll down. So the first thing you see is these videos, and then you come to the step-by-step tutorial. So the very first step tells you how to prepare your data file. It's a very simple file format, basically a plain text file. It can either be comma delimited, so like a CSV file, or it can be space delimited. And so here's an example, like the beginning of a file. So this stuff up here that I have highlighted is just comments in the file that are completely ignored. So the first line that matters in the file is the header. And so this defines what each column in the file is going to look like. So first one is a timestamp, then a longitude, a latitude, an ID, which we didn't really talk about. It is mentioned in the tutorial. This is something that you just make up, and it will allow you, if there's a natural way to separate your data. So for example, if you had data that was collected by a moving vehicle, you might separate it into ranges of speed, for example. And if you do that, if you tag each data point with an ID, then later in the visualization you can separate out. You can maybe only look at data that has one ID or some set of IDs. In the plots, you can separate the data by ID, and they'll each be given a different color. So this is something that's totally up to you. It can all be one thing. It can be like, instrument 1, instrument 2, whatever you want. And then you have any number of columns of your measured data. As I mentioned before, it's best to give it a label with units, because this is what's going to show up in the menus and in the axes, labels, and that type of thing in the plots. So this is the type of thing, like if you had your data in Excel, you can export a CSV file that RETIGO can read. The trick, probably the difficult part for a lot of people, is getting your time in this international standard format. It looks like this long, scary thing, but it's really quite simple. It's a 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day, and then 24-hour time, so hours, minutes, seconds, and then a plus or minus offset, hours and minutes from GMT. So that perfectly specifies your time. It doesn't leave any ambiguity. Unfortunately, not all instrumentation will naturally produce this type of timestamp. So whatever your instrument produces, you may have to convert it to this timestamp. So
one thing before you move to the timestamp converter, one thing this is Gail, I want to mention is if you do have data where, say, you have multiple sites, that might be say you have monitors at 5 locations and you want to look at them together in RETIGO. One thing I wanted to mention, and it's sort of just adding to what Matt said about the ID option, you would just combine those data sets together, and so you'd have one longer set of rows that would be combining those sites together. The time does not need to be organized. RETIGO can handle sort of rows that aren't in time order, so you could just put them in batches, by site, and RETIGO will order it, and it will look at the ID column as the identifier. So if it is uploading multiple sites, there's the time series plot option would allow you to see those multiple sites separated with different markers and colors. Also, when it's doing averaging of the data, if they're long time series and it's doing the average mode, it first will organize them by ID and then do the averaging. So I just wanted to mention that as another utility of the ID for that kind of a measurement setup. Okay.
Right.
my tangent is done.
Yeah, thanks, Gail. So that's a good point. So getting back to the timestamp, so if you have a different time format and you're trying to get it into this standard format, again, there's a little bit more information about that format if you want to come down here and try to understand it better. But if you're just interested in getting your time into that format, we can go to this timestamp converter tool. So this is a standalone web-based thing where you could, let's say you had your data or your times in Excel or something like that. You could just copy a whole column of those times and paste them here on the left and then convert them into the proper format. So we support many different formats. So Unix time, which is second since January 1st, 1970. A lot of instruments use that. Igor time, 2 different flavors of native Excel time, and I think one of them is used for Windows systems and one for Mac systems. They have a little bit different reference date, so it's important if you're using Excel, it's important to know which date system you're using. You may need to Google search a little bit on that to make sure you've got the right one. We support a MATLAB native time, and then a couple of generic time formats that are probably the least specific of all of these. So I'll actually pick the worst one, if you will, which is just hours, minutes, seconds. And there are some instruments that only report this. So it doesn't even tell you the date, and it doesn't tell you the time zone. So if you have hours, minutes, seconds type of data, you need to supply, what time zone was this. So I'll pick Eastern Standard, or maybe even Eastern Daylight. So we have both, and then a starting date. So I'll just pick a date in April. And so then, once you've done that, you've specified everything that needs to be specified, and then like I said, you could paste in hundreds or thousands of timestamps. I'll just make up a few, so you can also just type a few in. So it's, hours, minutes, seconds, and we'll pretend we had data taken every minute. So I'll just type a few of these in. And then once you have them in, you can just hit the convert button, and then you'll get the converted timestamps that you could then paste back into Excel or whatever tool you're using, and then those would be, you know, timestamps that RETIGO can use, and then you'd be able to export the various columns of your file and produce a RETIGO file. There's a whole tutorial just on this. So we have an example Excel file that has time that's not in the right format and has a few things that are that need to be fixed, and the tutorial will take you through that whole process, starting with that file. You can actually download the starting Excel file. It'll take you through the process of fixing it, putting the proper headers in, and converting the time steps, and then at the end producing a RETIGO file that you can then look at. And that's all can be found in the tutorial section.
Yeah, and I will say we have received 2 requests this month to consider adding additional time format to the list to try to help ease people's processing steps. So we are trying to take those requests and make those small updates. We probably wouldn't be waiting on a new large feature release for those kinds of changes. So if what's really helpful for us is if these options do not work for you and you would like to request a specific option, to just email us an example file, and we can try to consider doing that. That's a good question about RETIGO pulling data from stations outside the U.S. Currently, the METAR data, which is meteorological data that does have international locations, that's primarily airport data. The air monitoring data is only coming from right now from AirNow, which is the U.S. air official air quality data management system. That the AirNow system does also support where there's monitors that are mostly PM 2.5 monitors at U.S. embassies. And so we actually have just recently been working to ensure that data from U.S. embassies are included. And those are, you have to kind of look, you can look at airnow.gov to see which embassies are reporting PM 2.5 data. There are new embassies and consulates that are going to be activating monitoring in the next year. So the list may be also changing over time. Okay, so we have about 2 minutes left to take any immediate questions. We're also happy to take any that are emailed to us. I think as well on the international front, if there are data systems we should consider, I think at this point we're primarily looking at what would be considered government quality assured data. That's something we can consider in future development. We'd have to, ensure we'd be able to accomplish that, but we're, really any suggested improvements that may support a wide variety of users, we're happy to receive those ideas and consider them for the future development.